Hello and welcome to the TID Water and Power Podcast. I'm your host, Constance Anderson, and on this month's episode, we're discussing the regulatory process. Thanks to Schoolhouse Rock, we know that bills become laws, but what happens next? The law then goes through a regulatory process that determines how it will be implemented. Tasked with tracking this process and the potential positive and negative impacts of each regulation are TID's regulatory analysts, who are working to ensure the district and its customers are protected from unfair regulations. On this episode, I'm joined by TID Regulatory Analysts Herb Smart and Austin Avery to discuss the role of a regulatory analyst, how regulations and the regulatory process impact the district, and some of the key regulatory proceedings they are tracking now. Herb and Austin, thanks for joining us.
Thanks. Cool to be here.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Okay, so Herb, I'm going to point to you first and say thank you for coming back to the TID Water and Power Podcast for your second turn. You had joined us previously for episode 10 back in February of 2022 when we were talking about the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, and we're happy to have you back in your regulatory analyst capacity. But would you give us a quick overview again of your history with the district?
Yeah, I must have done something right. It's good to be back. I've been with the district for 13 years, and I started off as a public information specialist. I had a background in journalism, and it was a natural transition into the district. I was working at the time for our current general manager now, Michelle Reimers, who was heading up that area back then. And then I transitioned in 2013, and I worked through 2016 in an analyst role working on statewide water policy for our general manager at the time, and worked on that and kind of developed a love for the water regulatory policy making and climate in California. And then I came back to the communications, public information area in 2016 for a couple of years. And I worked there briefly and managed the division and all of the projects and various tasks that the communications team is a part of. It was well before the podcast era, so I didn't have to worry about that necessarily. And then back a few years back in 2018, I moved back into a water regulatory analyst role where I serve currently and oversee water policy and water regulations and advocating on behalf of the district's customers.
Awesome. That sounds like you've seen a lot, you've done a lot, and we're happy to have you back here in the podcast studio to share that with us.
Yeah, it's awesome to be here.
All right, Austin, give us a little bit of your background with the district, if you would.
Yeah, so I don't have the seen a lot and the done a lot like my counterpart with her, but I am fortunate enough to be at TID. So prior to joining the district, I had worked on the East Coast for a think tank for a little bit, and I had also worked for an association agency that represented electric utilities here in California. And then in April of 2019, I became the luckiest guy in the world because I was able to join Turlock Irrigation District, and I've just recently hit that 4-year milestone with y'all, and it's been absolutely great. When I was hired for TID, I got hired on as part of the government affairs team as the TID's energy regulatory analyst, and so my focus is on legislation and regulations pertaining to energy policy here in California, and so that's the role that I serve for the district.
Awesome. Well, we are thrilled to have you here at TID and thrilled to have you both on the podcast today. Okay, so let's start with this because I'm regulatory analyst. So I'm picturing like you go to a party, you go to your kid's soccer game, and somebody says, "Hey, Herb, Austin, what do you do?" And you say, "I'm a regulatory analyst." And I imagine that goes one of two ways. They're either like, "Oh, what is that? Tell me more," or they're like, "I'm not touching that with a 10-foot pole," and they promptly end the conversation. So let's start with what is a regulatory analyst? What does that mean, and how does it apply to each of the areas that you guys cover, both water and power? Herb, you want to start us off?
Yeah, Constance, it does take a little bit of description, doesn't it, right? So regulatory analysts, I think the way to kind of start looking at it would be like TID has a lot of different staff working on a lot of different things. And we have staff that follows going back to the Schoolhouse Rock thing, we have staff that tracks legislation and follows that. And then, of course, once legislation becomes a law, then the regulatory agencies step in and we start to work with them on how to craft regulations, and as do other people across the state and federal government. And we also have staff here that when the regulations are complete, that work on the compliance end of that. So those two areas have been kind of covered historically with the district for quite some time, but we had looked into it and realized that there was kind of more of a holistic approach needed to water policy and energy policy. And we kind of looked into that and provide support for them in that capacity. There's two categories that it could really be broken down to as an analyst, as a regulatory analyst on the water side for me and the energy side for Austin. Is the first category is we try and look at the imminent threats in regulation that might be facing the district, threats that are threats to the district's operations or threats that are threats to the district's budget, where increased fees could be coming in. And so we try and look at those things and see laws that are going to affect and kind of try and find the laws are what needs to get enforced, but the regulation is really more of the how it gets enforced. And so we tend to really delve deep into that and see if it'll affect the district. The second category is really things that are not necessarily imminent threats that we follow, but things that could kind of elevate to imminent threats. So large trends in water policy, large trends in energy policy that we see as being things in our expertise that are a little concerning, and we could see 5 years down the road or less, or if longer term, 10 years down the road, that could be problems for the district. And so we kind of go to a lot of state meetings and monitor a lot of regulatory agencies to see where they're going in terms of taking laws and putting them on the books for regulations and what those regulations mean for our customers.
Okay. Austin, how about you on the energy side?
Yeah, I think that the energy side is very, very similar to what Herb just described. If legislation describes the what, regulations describe the how. And so on the energy side of things, one of the key things that we're doing is we're working with departments across TID to really understand the impact that these regulatory proceedings are going to have on their positions. And so that's one of the first things that we look at in terms of our approach and when we're tracking these regulatory developments. Herb and I both are actively following proceedings across a variety of state agencies, but that involvement is key in our roles so that we know what's going on, and then we can inform staff as appropriate when these regulations develop, and the pace and the scale, and then what it means. To do that, we work with our subject matter experts. And so as regulatory analysts, like Herb said, we're not a subject matter expert in anything, but what we're here to do is holistically look at the regulatory landscape here in California, which is constantly changing.
Absolutely.
And then we're here to step in and help these staff try to fix a regulation or adjust it in a way that doesn't impact their job in a negative light, and in turn, our customers who we serve. So that's a little bit of my role on the energy side of things.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Okay, so from a high level, what are some of the specific roles that come with this job?
Yeah, so I think I'll kind of kick things off a little bit with this. I think that the groundwork for which everything is built on for Herb and I as regulatory analysts starts with communication. Regulations are actively moving and they're changing. And so for us as staff, we want to be communicating those changes as they're happening. And so communication is the bedrock for which we operate as analysts. Secondarily, if communication is sort of the first ingredient, the next thing that we look at is information gathering. I want to gather as much information as I can for my staff so that when it comes time for them to step in and potentially help me try to adjust or change a regulation in a way that doesn't negatively impact our operations, I have my ducks in a row so that we're prepared to sort of make as great of an impact as we possibly can for the benefit of our customers. To do that, one of the ways to do that is both oral in oral communication, but it's also through policy writing. Policy writing is a great way to make a point without making an enemy, because you're just talking about the facts, and we just want the facts to come through. And so that's another key thing that both Herb and I do in our roles here at TID. And then kind of finally, I think a little bit for me, it is a sort of a project manager role. Sometimes these regulations, they oftentimes will leave you with tasks that maybe don't have a definite end date. And so if we can help staff at TID in terms of working on this regulation that is now sort of the law of the land, whether it's in a project manager role or in an assistance in a support category, that's what we want to do, just so that we're in compliance. And so kind of like jack of all trades, master of none. That's our job.
All right. I really like how you guys categorized that the legislation is the what, the regulation is the how. But Herb, can you tell us about some of the other differences between legislation and regulation?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it makes a lot of sense. I think the biggest thing is legislation obviously is drafted by our state or federal legislators, and then it gets signed into law. In California, it gets signed into law by the governor. And then it tends to be often very general language. And then it's up to the regulatory agencies to, like Austin had said, the what and the how. Well, that's the what. There's new legislation. There's new law on the books. And the how is where the regulators, the regulatory agencies, through their processes of public involvement and rulemaking, come in and they figure out the how. And so a perfect example would be the State Water Resources Control Board, which is one regulatory agency, the primary regulatory agency that I tend to follow in the state. And they're the regulatory agency. They're in charge of water rights administration and water quality throughout the state. And there have been numerous laws over the past 13 years that I've been involved at the district where the legislator has given the state board authority to look into X, Y, or Z. And then the state board, well, it's state board for short, they go through and they basically have a regulatory process that includes how these regulations are going to affect water users and water consumers and water purveyors. And so that's one area where there's that balance, that difference, so to speak, between legislation and regulation. But there's a lot of there's a real symbiotic relationship when you look at the two as well. Austin and I, we're not necessarily in charge of tracking and following legislation as it's being discussed by the legislature and elected officials, but we work with our external affairs department manager, Josh Weimer. He's been on the show before, and we work with him. He covers all the legislation, and we have TID works with lobbyists and other people as well that follow these pieces of legislation. And a lot of times, it's important before it becomes a regulation, or if it's going to become a regulation, to kind of consult a little bit and say, "Hey, Austin or Herb, take a look at this piece of legislation that's being discussed in the legislature. Take a look at it. Let me know what that would look like to you guys when you work with the regulatory agencies if it becomes a law. What does that mean for our customers? What does that mean, for TID as a whole?" And so there's like a really balancing relationship in there when it comes to legislation. And we really do ask the question multiple times over, how will this affect the district when it comes to legislation or regulation as it's being crafted, and especially when it becomes finalized. We want our customers to be prepared as to how it's going to affect them or may affect them. And so we do that as well.
Now, Herb, you mentioned, thank you for that explanation, by the way, and you mentioned several times these regulatory bodies that we work with or that you guys coordinate with and follow. What are some of those regulatory agencies?
Yeah, for the water side, like I said, the big one that I tend to cover a lot is the State Water Resources Control Board, or State Water Board for short. They are in charge of water quality within the state and water rights administration in the state. They also, a few years back, got purview or overview over the drinking water system within the state and all of that. And so I work a lot with them and their staff. They're a huge agency. I work with their staff on a lot of different rulemakings and a lot of different workshops and various types of format regulatory proceedings that they have. And so I work with them a lot. They have 5 board members that are appointed by the governor and approved by the legislature as a whole. So they're not elected, but they are very, very influential. They have an influential board and a staff as well. And so we work a lot with them. Another one that I work with quite a lot is the Department of Water Resources, the state's Department of Water Resources. They're in charge of things like statewide water management, snow surveys, and we work with them on dam safety with their Division of Safety of Dams. And then also the Department of Water Resources, they oversee and regulate the landmark 2014 Sustainable Groundwater Management Act law. And so we work a lot with them.
And again, if you're interested in finding out more about the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, episode 10.
Yeah, that's right. That was a fun one. Also, I cover the California Water Commission. That is the regulatory body, the appointed body from the governor that the Department of Water Resources presents to and goes to get their regulations adopted. And so they have 9 commissioners and they're appointed and that's there as well. And then another regulatory agency that's one of the big 4, I call it, for me, would be the Delta Stewardship Council. The TID operates the Tuolumne River, and that flows into the San Joaquin. the San Joaquin River flows into the Delta. And so, what happens in the Delta and how they perform regulations and various enforcement within the Delta matters to us. And what we do as far as what gets into the Delta matters to them. And they're people that live and work and rely on the legal Delta as defined. So I work a lot with the Stewardship Council as well.
Okay. So it sounds like you're largely focused on state agencies versus federal. Why is that? Or is that accurate? And if so, why?
Yeah, no, that is an accurate statement. I think part of the reasons for that would be state water regulatory bodies have more of a direct impact on the district, or more of a potential to have a direct impact on the district. At the federal level, there's regulatory agencies that I'm familiar with and work with on various things, like the United States EPA, and I work with them, but a little bit less of potential to have impact on the district on a larger level. And so work a lot in that capacity with state regulatory bodies over more federal bodies. But there are plenty of federal bodies that we're aware of and work with. Also, California regulations, because of the way, California tends to be like a leader in climate and air and energy policy and water policy in terms of being more protective of the environment. So those laws that get passed in California that turn into regulations are generally more protective than a lot of federal laws and regulations anyway. So the work just kind of naturally goes to there to work on those regulations. And then I think the largest federal regulatory proceeding going on right now has been really going on much in earnest since 2009, and that's been the relicensing of the Don Pedro project with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And we have because it's definitely more than a full-time job for the person, we have a staff member that handles the relicensing of that with all the various components that are in there. And so that's the biggest federal thing going on in terms of the regulatory world, and we have a staff member completely devoted to that. And so that's
absolutely.
Also another reason why.
Okay, very good. All right, so let's flip over to Austin on the energy side. What about the federal agencies that you coordinate with?
So very similar to Herb on the energy side with respect to federal policy and our coordination efforts. When we look at federal policy, going back to what we discussed earlier, what's the imminent threat? What's going on at the federal level doesn't fall into that category one, that imminent threat. And so while as a regulatory analyst, I'm looking at federal policy and how it might trickle down and impact TID, the bulk of my time and my efforts is focused more predominantly on the state side. And so there's a variety of state agencies that TID looks to for compliance and needs to be in compliance under. And so the first one that I really spend a lot of time covering is the California Air Resources Board. What the California Air Resources Board does, and I'll acronym them CARB, what they do is they really look at California's greenhouse gas emissions, and they actively develop regulations that are designed to help sectors across the state reduce those overall emissions over time. And so that is the role of the California Air Resources Board. Concerning us, they actively regulate how we reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. And so oftentimes there are a lot of regulatory proceedings that are coming out of this agency that are assessing TID's emissions and then directing us on how we are to reduce those emissions, whether it's from equipment, purchases, in terms of contracts, hoarding. CARB is looking at those things, and then they're directing our actions in terms of reducing our overall emissions. And so for us as regulatory analysts and as staffers involved in this field, one of the things that we're actively trying to do is work with our regulatory agency as they develop regulations that will impact TID operations, seeing us reduce our overall emissions in a manner that protects, number one, our ratepayers, but also reflects the needs and operations and constraints of the district. And so there is a back and forth, and kind of like what we talked about earlier with CARB and all these state agencies, communication is the bedrock for which we can find a good solution and a final product that's workable for us as we seek to clean up the air. So that's CARB.
Okay. And you raise a good point that I think will kind of run through the entirety of today's discussion. And that's the fact that TID is always looking to comply with whatever the imposed regulation is, but to find a way to do so in a way that doesn't result in an unfair financial impact to our customers or to the district. And so I think it's good that you brought that up. What are some of the other regulatory agencies you work with?
The first agency that I think is something that I want to talk about is the California Energy Commission. And so the California Energy Commission is really, I think the best way to characterize them is a planning agency. And so what they're doing is they're planning the chart for how California is really going to fully realize its clean energy future. And so they're actively developing policy that is directed towards how we get to this clean future. And so oftentimes at the CEC, what we'll see regulations as well as workshops focused on emerging technologies and how they ought to be used, as well as regulations such that would potentially touch how we develop rates and how rate making impacts our customers. And so, just like the California Air Resources Board, even though the agency is different, the process stays the same, meaning we are actively working with staffers at the California Energy Commission to ensure that whatever regulation they develop, it is developed in such a manner that our operations, we can continue to do those in such a manner that does not negatively impact our customers. And again, that just takes careful collaboration as well as communication with this agency as they develop policies that will shape the technologies that we ultimately will be using and utilities across the state will be using as we sort of transition to this clean energy future. So that's what the California Energy Commission that sort of does. That's their focus. And then they also, as a final touch point on the CEC, they also serve as sort of the oversight agency for publicly owned utilities. We are subject to our governing boards, but the CEC also has a role in terms of oversight of the publicly owned utilities here in the state of California. The next one is the California Public Utilities Commission, and this is an agency that closely monitors and oversees the investor-owned utilities here in California. And what they do is they really develop rules and regulations on how these investor-owned utilities are to be operating and how they are to be serving their customers. And so the investor-owned utilities are under the California Public Utilities Commission, the CPUC, but oftentimes a rule that's developed for the investor-owned utilities, which though the investor-owned utilities are IOUs, they're a lot larger than the publicly owned utilities, the POUs. And so
so an IOU would be like a PG&E?
Yes, a PG&E, SoCal Edison, those would be examples of investor-owned utilities. And so the rules that are developed at the California Public Utilities Commission, oftentimes as a regulatory analyst for TID, I'm looking at those regulations that are in development and I'm going, okay, how could this impact, whether it's indirectly or potentially directly, our own operations, because there is cross-pollination and correlation amongst all the sister agencies here in California. And a big piece, my main thing that I do when I'm looking at the California Public Utilities Commission, the CPUC, and the rules that they developed is, do these rules and regulations potentially threaten our local control? And if they do, then we need to take some action to ensure that that agency doesn't overstep, because local control is important for us to achieve our goals. So that's the California Public Utilities Commission. The next one that I want to just briefly bring up to you, Constance, is the California Independent System Operator, or CAL-ISO. And so what the CAL-ISO does is they really operate the majority of California's grid and how energy flows across California. And so CAL-ISO develops a number of rules pertaining to greenhouse gas emissions and renewable energy. And for TID, we are our own balancing authority area, which means we're not in the California CAL-ISO's ecosystem, but just like the CPUC, how their rules for IOUs may trickle down and impact us, the CAL-ISO's rules concerning energy markets and energy policy could trickle down and impact us. So we closely monitor developments at the CAL-ISO, which is not a state regulatory agency. They're a non-governmental agency that operates the majority of California's grid. And so we monitor those. And we actually have a whole department here at TID that looks at energy markets and is focused on ISO. And it's a privilege to be a part of that team because there's a lot going on, and my role is to help them as best I can.
Okay, and that's interesting because there's kind of going back to that imminent threat or that more long-term threat. There's the working with the agencies that most directly impact publicly owned utilities, as TID is one. But then there's also keeping an eye on kind of what others are doing, either the IOUs or what's happening with Cal ISO.
Yep. Any other load serving entity. Absolutely.
Exactly. That could eventually impact what we're doing here. So that's a good point. Thanks for bringing that up. So I'm hearing a lot about like watching what's going on and what might impact the district. So it sounds like you guys kind of serve in almost like a watchdog role. How does your work protect the district?
Yeah, the how's a big question, right? I think the big thing that I would speak to is there's a lot of active engagement and commenting on. We've talked a lot about regulatory processes and rulemakings, and so when those are going on, whether they even have a remote chance of affecting the district, we're usually listening in and providing comments on that. I'll give a couple quick examples. I think when the drought of 2014-15 occurred, the State Water Resources Control Board, rightfully so, under a drought proclamation, they started looking at urban conservation regulations and residential water conservation regulations. Well, TID doesn't provide that type of water. We provide irrigation water, right? But we were following that because a lot of the comments that were coming in were talking about, well, agriculture also needs to have conservation regulations. And our comments were like, wait a second, our 5-member local board, we've been cutting back before 2014 even came. We've been reading what's going on in the watershed. And so we were able to provide that type of comment in there. So protect in that way. I think related to the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, DWR, the Department of Water Resources, everyone agreed in the law that groundwater is best managed locally, right? And so we come in, and as they're drafting the regulations, we're making sure those regulations continue to give local power to our local agencies that have been developed since the law was passed, and making sure that it wasn't a little bit of a scope creep to allowing through regulation what legislation wasn't able to do. And so we were protecting our district in that way, our customers in that way. And then the last thing too, I mentioned the 2017 Oroville spillway incident up north, right? Well, after that happened, the state was looking to get a lot of money and increased budgets for people within the state so they could, the Division of Safety of Dams through the department could be able to, for lack of a better phrase, protect, and make safe these dams and their spillways in flood events. And so they were developing fee structures for that. And what it meant was sometimes our fees were going to go up, even though we've been complying with a perfectly safe dam. And so we had to make sure that there was some level of equity, for lack of a better word, or some dispersion of making sure we didn't have to pay the same amount as others or pay for services that we wouldn't be getting from something. So that was just another area. So a lot of different ways we protect. It's not as direct sometimes as we might think it is. Sure,
absolutely. Austin, how about from your chair?
What's the saying? Teamwork makes the dream work. It's definitely it just rings true. Because a lot of times for us as regulatory analysts to be successful, we have to collaborate. There are 50 publicly owned utilities here in the state of California. If all 50 of us get on the same page concerning an issue at a regulatory agency, concerning a regulatory process that's actively underway, the likelihood that we're able to make a change is going to go up exponentially, as opposed to if TID just goes out on its own and tries to fix something. And so the key thing here is lots of collaboration is needed for us to get to where we need to go. And ultimately, that is where we want to go, is we want to protect our ratepayers, and we want to make sure that we're able to provide reliable and affordable water and power. And collaboration is key.
Absolutely. Let's stay on that collaboration theme, actually, and talk a little bit about the internal departments that you guys coordinate with at TID.
Yeah, so I think on the energy side, just to kind of start it off, there's so many. I feel like I'm actively a part of so many different administrations and departments. The Power Supply Administration and in particular resource planning, I'm actively involved with them as we look at regulatory policy at the California Energy Commission and the policy side of things and how we're going to get resources to serve load looking out ahead. Electrical engineering and operations, there are many plans and regulations that are actively in development development that influence our infrastructure and design and how we go through those things. TID's fleet department, when we think about greenhouse gas emissions, we are actively working with them to sort of help mitigate that on a regulatory front. And then there's more as needed. I mean, finance is another one too, when we think about rate making and what that can mean for the district. So many, but those are a few that I'd want to highlight.
All right. Herb, how about on the water side?
Yeah, there's a lot of different divisions and departments that I tend to work with. I think the biggest ones, though, would be from my side, the water distribution department, our water distribution operators, those who manage water quality and test for water quality, those that work up in LaGrange for drinking water issues. We serve the small community of LaGrange up near Don Pedro in the foothills. And so we have that going on. I work a lot with them. Water planning. We have a water planning department. They've obviously developed plans, right? We have ag water management plans that we submit to the state regularly. We used to have groundwater management plans submitted to the state regularly, but the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act developed a new plan that would supersede those plans called the groundwater sustainability plans. And so we have one that's been submitted and we're waiting to hear back from the state on that. So I work a lot with the department that puts those together. I work a lot with dam safety and the engineers that lead that up, and our chief dam safety engineer. And then, of course, lastly, and I would say most importantly, I work with the communications department on things such as this podcast or even helping develop key messages or water policy talking points, or even maybe getting asked to speak as a subject matter expert out in the community at large or go to events. And so I would definitely say, given my background, that's probably the most important area where I work.
And we certainly appreciate that, Herb. All right. So staying with collaboration, what about some of the external agencies that you guys collaborate with? Herb, you want to start us off?
Yeah, there's a lot of them. We certainly can't name them all, but I think the ones that rise to the top of the list for me would be the Association of California Water Agencies, also known as ACWA. I'm on a few committees and work with them regularly. It's great. Austin's right. Teamwork does make the dream work. It's good to have friends, right? And it amplifies your voice. And so I work a lot with them on a lot of key issues. And they're a big voice. ACWA says they represent some 90% of delivered water within the state of California. So it's nice to be able to advocate with them on issues where we align.
Sure.
I also work with the counties in a lot of ways. The counties have water advisory committees, and I work a lot with them. Believe it or not, counties are local regulators, right? And so we work a lot with Stanislaus and Merced counties in that capacity. There's a lot of businesses, right, that care about regulation. So I work with one of the big ones is the Manufacturers Council of Central Valley. Gallo is one of the big companies that's a part of that. And so TID represents its customers there and provides information to businesses that many of whom are our energy customers too. Farm bureaus, Stanislaus County, Merced County have very active farm bureaus and definitely good to use to work with them as a way of getting information out and collaborating and letting them feel safe to know that people are looking out for them. And then the San Joaquin Tributaries Authority is also another agency. We work closely with agencies that deliver water, that are local here as well. And I think of the Tuolumne River, we're a member of that. Modesto Irrigation District, our partner, is a member of that, as is the City and County of San Francisco and their San Francisco Public Utilities Commission as well. And so we work together a lot on a lot of combined issues of interest there. And then the last one I can think of is the California Special Districts Association. But believe it or not, TID is a special district. Under state law, an irrigation district is a special district. We work a lot with cemetery districts and fire prevention districts, and we are able to help and work with them on issues because a lot of alignment is there as well. And so we work with them frequently.
Okay. Austin.
Yeah, Constance, I told you teamwork makes the dream work. I got another one for you. Small fish, big pond. So some of the other agencies that we're a part of on the energy side of things, ACWA is an agency that we're involved with, and they're great. They're absolutely fantastic, focusing on energy issues concerning the water side of TID's operations. So as the energy regulatory analyst, I'm actively sitting on different committees at ACWA, trying to influence regulatory policy at some of these state agencies that I had mentioned earlier in a manner that helps us. And then the second one, and really this agency is a huge one, is the California Municipal Utilities Association, or CMUA. Many of the publicly owned utilities here in California are a member of this association agency. And because of that, the consequences, the CMUA sort of puts us in positions where we're able to intersect with one another that we perhaps wouldn't be able to do on our own. So they act as the connective tissue that helps us collaborate and advocate on policy related to issues that really impact all of us. And you'd be surprised, there's a lot of areas where we can find common ground because of these association agencies are committed to bringing those areas to centralized and basically crystallized focus. And then we can see, oh, these are the areas where we agree, and then we're able to just do some great work on behalf of our customers. And so those are the two ones that I would say are the key for me.
All right. Now, obviously, we're talking a lot about water and power today because those are the two areas that you guys specialize in. But there must be other regulations that impact other areas of the district. Austin, how are those typically handled?
Yeah, no, Constance, and it goes back to jack of all trades, master of none. There are regulations that impact every department across the district. And looking at Herb and I's roles, he's the water regulatory analyst. I'm the energy regulatory analyst. I'm not an HR regulatory specialist. I'm not a finance regulatory specialist. But the important thing is that while we have staff that are working on these regulations, we as regulatory analysts are always available to help them. And so regulations impact different departments across our company, and they're typically handled by those departments as they come up. But as TID team members, we're always ready to wear whatever hat is needed and help wherever possible.
All right. Austin, I'm going to keep you on the spot here. Tell us a little bit about how the regulatory process actually works. So if we flip back to Schoolhouse Rock again, we know the process that a bill takes to become a law. How does the regulatory process work?
So the first thing is no regulation's the same. Regardless of what agency is starting the regulation, no regulation is the same. And the process, especially in the pre-rulemaking stage, so this is before the formalized regulatory process takes shape, is the same. What I mean by that is sometimes you can have a pre-rulemaking stage where you have work group meetings and you have sort of workshops with between the regulatory agency staffers and the utility personnel, trying to figure out, okay, how is the regulation going to look like once it kicks off? That can last a long time. And when I say a long time, I mean years. It can last a while. Once the regulatory process begins and it kicks off, I think there are a few things maybe to touch on in terms of the lifespan and process. So the first thing is once the regulation has sort of been developed, you have what's called a 45-day comment period. So regulation comes out, there's a bunch of documentation that is released along with the regulation. At that point in time, when we say 45-day comment period, as a regulatory analyst, I have 45 days to get my ducks in a row. And basically, it's the culmination of all of the work that we did in the pre-rulemaking process. And you culminate that in written and oral testimony. And so what we do at this time during the 45-day public comment period is we are submitting comment letters, and then we're also providing oral testimony on all of the regulatory back and forth and investigation and collaboration with our subject matter experts internally on how this regulation may impact them. And that becomes crystallized during that 45-day period. Okay, so now we have this 45-day period, and then it closes. And then at that point in time, what the regulatory agency will do across the board, doesn't matter which agency we're talking about, what they do is they take in all of the public comments and they look at them and they see, okay, where is our policy getting criticized the most? And depending on, so they're going to take those things in, and depending on what their analysis shows, the next step in the process may be one of two things. Option one is we have what's called a 15-day comment period. And so this is where the regulatory agency has looked at the public comments that they received and gone, oh, by golly, we need to make some changes here because there's enough substantial comments on a certain section that we've developed that's probably going to need to change. And so if they think that there's enough of an issue, they're going to make a change. And then they're going to release a second 15-day comment period. Just like that 45-day comment period, Constance, what we do at that time is it's pedal to the metal, and we read the rule once it comes out, and then we have 15 days to submit any further comments and any further testimony that we have, data, information, whatever, to try and get the rule to a place where it's workable for our staff and for our personnel. And then oftentimes after this after this is complete, these regulations go to the state agencies, governing boards, and they vote on them. And then with all these regulations, how I said at the beginning, no regulations the same. A lot of them are going into effect at different times. But in a general high level, that's kind of the regulatory process and what we're doing as staff once things kick off. So it can be incredibly fast, incredibly slow, but it always keeps you on your toes.
Absolutely. My goodness, it sounds like it. Okay, so what I'd like to do now is to dive into some of the specific regulations that you guys are actively working on. So kind of looking at it from the process that Austin sort of laid out for us as far as, no two regulations follow this exact same path, but generally there's kind of a process that they work through. Herb, let's start with some of those regulations that are about to be implemented.
Yeah, I think one really good example of that, because it fits so much of a broad span of past, present, and future, would be the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. We always call it SGMA. For by way of quick background, SGMA basically says three things need to get done. There's a lot more in between there, but it basically says local agencies need to form groundwater sustainability agencies, or little local regulatory agencies, to manage groundwater. That's the first thing. The second thing is they need to develop GSPs, or groundwater sustainability plans, to determine how that water is going to be managed. And then third, they have to get results based on that plan through, for our subbasin, the Turlock subbasin, through 2042. So you just take a look at some of that timeline. The Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, we've been following since 2014, when it was even before then, when it was signed into law. And we've been following that. And then we formed groundwater sustainability agencies. TID is a member of the West Turlock subbasin Groundwater Sustainability Agency. We formed that in 2017. But the work was not yet done. We had to develop a groundwater sustainability plan, which got turned in to the state for review, and is still pending review. Got turned in January of 2022. And so we did that. And so we're still not done yet, right? There's still a process to go in the regulation. And so now we've worked with other water agencies. We've developed this groundwater sustainability plan. And now we're sitting back, and the state is taking a look at it. The Department of Water Resources is reviewing it, as they've done many, many other agencies throughout the state. And they're taking a look at it, and people have commented on that, and we're waiting to hear back from them. And we're supposed to hear back from them by January of 2024. And so we're looking to hear back from them on that. And we're going to get word that it's either been approved, that it's incomplete and needs some revisions, or that it's inadequate, and it goes into a process with the enforcement agency, with the State Water Resources Control Board. And so, of course, legislation also can tweak over time. There have been attempts to modify some of the bills that made up SGMA, and so we're certainly looking at that as well. And so you see, 2014, the law was signed, turned in our plan in 2022. It's going to get approved in 2024, but yet the plan goes 20 years through 2042, and trying to make groundwater sustainable within our Turlock subbasin. And so just never ending. I think Austin said increasingly fast or increasingly slow. Also, it could be increasingly long.
Absolutely. You have to definitely have some endurance to make it the full lifespan of some of these regulations.
Most definitely.
Okay. Austin, what about on the energy side?
Yeah, so for us right now, one of the regulations that we're working on and is getting ready to wrap up here, and we've been working on for the past 4 years, is developed by the California Air Resources Board. So this is the agency that's responsible for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. This is called the Advanced Clean Fleets Regulation. So let's talk vehicles, Constance. So what the Advanced Clean Fleets does is it's really a first in the world policy that is going to require government, private, federal, public sector fleets across the state that have heavy duty fleets. So this means heavy duty vehicle fleets. So this means the vehicles that are 8,500 pounds and above, to start phasing out those vehicles because they run on fossil fuels. And so what Advanced Clean Fleets, or ACF, does is it's going to require any and everybody who's got a large fleet here in California to begin phasing out their vehicles. So that's essentially what it is that ACF's going to do. At least at a high level. Let's kind of get into the weeds a little bit more. Starting in 2024, what we'll have to do as an irrigation district is we'll have to have 50% of our purchases that we make beginning in 2024 be either plug-in hybrid, battery electric, or a hydrogen sourced vehicle. So as our vehicles are coming up for retirement, one of the things that our fleet department's going to have to do is they're going to have to be looking at the landscape and the technologies and the vehicles that are in development, and they're going to have to be assessing whether those vehicles can be like for like in terms of replacing the vehicle that they're going to be having the same job responsibility for. So Advanced Clean Fleets has been going on for 4 years. This has been a long, arduous process. And we're nearing the end of it. For us as a government agency, what really this means is that we're just going to have to really think about emerging technologies and emerging fuels, and what technologies and what fuels fit best in our ecosystem. And so that's going to be a key thing that we're going to be looking at as we move forward with Advanced Clean Fleets. So 2024, you have 50% purchase requirement, and then by 2028 and then onward, you have this 100% purchase requirement that all agencies will have under this regulation for these new fleet vehicles. And it's exciting because we're seeing the emergence of battery electric vehicles, and we're also seeing the emergence of hydrogen. And so as a staff, we have so many people across this company who are experts at these emerging technologies and fuels. And so it's going to be exciting to see which of these emerging renewables rises to the forefront in terms of a fit for our company. So Advanced Clean Fleets would be one regulation that I would cite for you as one that's currently actively ongoing and we're tracking carefully.
Okay. And it's interesting because you talk about, what a long process that has been over the last 4 years, which is a long time. And then going back to Herb's groundwater example, that's been going on since 2014. And so it's like they all each have their own process and their own timelines, and you just got to hang on for the ride, it seems like.
Well said. I agree.
All right. So now let's take a look at some of those regulations that have already been implemented and what your role then becomes at that stage of the process. Austin, you want to go?
So one of the things as an energy regulatory analyst that we do is we're responsible for wearing that project manager hat. We here at TID and in publicly owned utilities and really all the utilities across the state have what's called a wildfire mitigation plan. And we've had podcasts in the past where we've talked about the wildfire mitigation plan. And as an energy regulatory analyst, I sort of wear a lot of different hats with respect to this plan and really the regulatory proceedings and the policy implications that are all associated with how we reduce wildfires here in the state of California. So right now, what I would want everyone to know is we're currently in the process of updating our wildfire mitigation plan for 2023, and this is going to be a comprehensive update. And really, what a comprehensive update looks like from a regulatory standpoint, meaning what's the direction in a comprehensive update is every 3 years when we go and update our wildfire mitigation plan, what we do is we bring in an outside consultant who serves as a subject matter expert, SME, on all aspects pertaining to the information that we would find in the plan. And so what we do is we lean on this individual or individuals as we go and we assess and update our wildfire mitigation plan. And so that's kind of maybe hat one that I wear with respect to wildfire themed regulatory developments and processes, as we kind of serve as an MC for the plan's development. Separately, okay, so you've got a plan, but you also have working groups through those association agencies. So think of the California Municipal Utilities Association, like we talked about earlier, that are actively trying to influence public policy. So both legislation and regulations pertaining to how the state of California reduces its risk of wildfires, but also the emissions from wildfires. So you have a lot of different policy topics that cross different agencies that are associated with this working group that's led by our association agency. And we're a part of that. As regulatory staffers, we're a part of that because we want to be a part of the collaborative process. Silence is a lie, and we have to be a part of it. And so we're actively involved in those things, trying to influence different regulatory developments across these across these state agencies. Which, speaking of state agencies, Constance, remember I talked about how the California Public Utilities Commission They are in charge of the IUs, and sometimes their regulations trickle down to public utilities. Well, Constance, I got to tell you, this is so true when it comes to wildfire emissions with respect to electrical infrastructure and the general orders and the codes that we have to follow as we seek to harden our equipment and harden our infrastructure to reduce wildfire emissions. And so a lot of times the California Public Utilities Commission, they're actively developing regulations that look like construction standards for how we are to do things. We want to be following those because we want to speak into these general orders and these code development processes, because here's the thing. At TID, we're home to a bunch of subject matter experts that live and breathe this type of work. They put policy into practice. Why wouldn't you want those people speaking into these regulatory development processes? And so I want to make sure that happens. And so we're actively involved with that. And so that looks like regulation. That also looks like legislation. There's legislation that will pass that will also, sometimes it'll have the why and the how in it. And then there's also regulations, like what we've talked about, that influence what it is that we may have to do. And as a regulatory staffer, what I'm trying to do is help implement, implement the regulations such as the plan, but then also respond to policy, whether it's legislation or regulation, where we go, you know what? I like the idea, but let's try to make it a little bit better.
Okay, Herb, what about a regulation that you are working on that has been implemented?
Yeah, I think a lot of people who've driven around in our territory probably still see signs today that say "worth your fight,"
yes.
and talk a lot about that plan. That was a campaign that the irrigation districts that we, TID and our partner MID, worked on to bring advocacy about a specific regulation. And that regulation was the Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan that the State Water Resources Control Board adopted. And it's a plan they adopt regularly. They update it regularly. They have a 1995 plan. They have a 2006 plan. And then more recently, they updated it in 2018. And that's prior to the lead up of that is when you may have heard of, or seen the Worth Your Fight campaign. And so that was one regulatory proceeding that we worked heavily on. And right now it's been adopted, but now we move into the implementation phase. And so what that means is that there's a way in which the state board, and I'll back up a bit because what they actually decided was their preferred alternative through their environmental document, which is called a substitute environmental document. They're not beholden to CEQA or the California Environmental Quality Act, like a lot of agencies are. They have a comparative document called this SED. And so their SED had an alternative in there that they adopted to have 40% of in-stream flows, in addition to what currently goes down, be put down the Tuolumne River. Obviously, that's something that would affect our customers greatly and was spur the Worth Your Fight campaign. And so we fought that heavily, and some 7,000 petitioners within our service territory and MID service territory said, wait a second, that's not good. We don't want that. They still adopted it, and they're moving forward into the implementation phase of that. And I think part of that kind of folds into the voluntary agreement process that fits into that. Now that they've developed this regulation and said 40% of water down the river is what's best for fish species, now they're going into a process where they need to figure out how that would come to be, if it possibly could. There's a ton of legal proceedings going on in effect as well. And I'm not a legal analyst, I'm a regulatory analyst, but there's a lot of paths that we're following there too. And so TID is one member of many, many agencies that are working to come up with a voluntary agreement where we could make the fish do well at minimal harm to the district's ratepayers and those that rely on agricultural water in our area. And so the voluntary agreement process is one mechanism in which the Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan could be implemented, and I would say kind of close to finalized from the regulatory front. But another avenue, which I don't think really anybody wants, would be the state board going into a water rights proceeding to implement the Bay Delta Plan. And that's costly, a lot of attorney fees, a lot of costly fees. It's longer. And if we're going to improve salmon species within the river, it's going to be best if it's done sooner rather than later, especially TID and MID and others have put forward the Tuolumne River Management management plan and our proposal for all of that, and that's been outlined before in previous podcasts that you've done. But there's two paths, and so that's the implementation path. Is it a voluntary agreement, or is it a water rights proceeding? And it's currently being implemented, and it may take a lot longer than intended.
All right, Herb, let's have you stay on that, stay with water, and talk about a regulatory proceeding that is either in the early stages, in the being discussed currently, or something that you see is coming down the pipeline.
Yeah. I'll give you one that's not even in the regulatory phase yet. This year, a lot of legislation, and some probably will pass, is being offered up by elected officials within the state regarding the state of water rights. And just kind of by way of background, TID holds some rights individually, some rights jointly with our partner Modesto Irrigation District, and we hold those rights on behalf of our diverse communities that we represent. And so we hold those rights, and we operate the river and store water and a lot of different things based on those rights. And we do that. And there's been a lot of discussion around there's been a whole podcast that my good friend Jason Karkeet did with you on water rights and goes through all the pre-1914 rights, the post-1914 rights. But a lot of the legislation right now is looking at pre-1914 rights and giving the State Water Board authority over those rights for a lot of different ways and basically expanding their authority. That's something we have serious concerns with, and a lot of our colleagues have serious concerns with. And so that's in the works right now. We're looking at that legislation. Eventually, it could be a regulation, and we'd be working with the state board on that. But the tone of the state and the change leadership that the state is looking to have in relation to water rights and where water policy is going is really, really scrutinizing those rights and so taking a look at those. And so obviously that affects us greatly, and we're looking at that, and we're advocating on behalf of our customers for that. And so water rights, one potential proceeding it's going to happen. It's just a matter of when. And then another thing I can think of as well would be related to water quality. Water quality in the Central Valley. There's a lot of legacy problems that we need to fix related to things like salt and nitrates, right? And going all the way back to 2006, there was the CV Salts program, which stands for Central Valley Salinity Alternatives for Long-Term Sustainability. They eventually moved that out and changed that into this kind of new salt and nitrate management plan. And we're working a lot with that. But it goes to say that some regulations directly affect TID as a water provider, but some regulations don't really hit us, but they hit the individual customer and individual water users. And so we need to work on that so we can inform our customers. And so this salt and nitrate management plan, which stemmed from CV salts, is something we're working on related to salt and nitrate water quality, because those things could affect drinking water and agriculture in a negative way. And so just a few years back, the Valley Water Collaborative was formed, a local kind of agency association of individual growers to comply with that law, which I mentioned before. The State Water Board is in charge of water quality, but they have 9 regional water quality boards. And the one that implemented this specific regulation is the one in which we fall, the Central Valley Regional Water Quality Control Board. And so they are in charge of this salt and nitrate management plan, and our growers and us as an agency are working to make sure that they are complying with that in a way that's not overburdensome for them.
All right, Austin, what have you got?
So, Constance, one of the things that I would say is the what and the how. Going back to the what and how, legislation is what, regulation is how. A perfect example of this is Senate Bill 1158. So Senate Bill 1158 was passed last year, and it was passed. The legislator passed it. When you look at the bill itself, it tells us what it wants the state of California to do. But now the California Energy Commission is responsible for the how in terms of making SB 1158 fully actualized. So let's talk a little bit about what's going on. So SB 1158, and maybe to start at the top, is SB or TID and utilities across the state of California are actively accounting for and monitoring the greenhouse gas emissions associated with their portfolio. So the resources that we use to serve our customers' load, our retail load, we are actively doing that. What SB 1158 does is it requires load-serving entities here in the state of California to report the hourly greenhouse gas emissions associated with the energy that's being delivered and is being used to serve our customers' load. This ask and for context to sort of maybe provide a little bit of commentary on the how here. The rule will go into effect and it will kind of be finalized in 2024. So the rule is finalized in 2024, but it doesn't go into effect until 2028. The reason why is because the process of hourly tracking for greenhouse gas emissions associated with the energy that's being used to serve our customers' demand on an annual standpoint is a huge operational lift for our staff here internally at TID. And so this is an example of an active regulatory proceeding that's in its infancy stages that from now until we round the corner into the next year is just going to be, we're going to see a lot of workshops and we're going to see a lot of wordsmithing. We're going to see a lot of collaboration in terms of regulatory writing across the agencies, the load serving agencies that are going to be under what SB 1158 is going to require for us. And this is this deeper level of transparency that we're committed to provide as a water and electric provider of the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the energy that we use to serve our customers. And so it's going to be a long process. We're in the pre-rulemaking stage. Then we'll enter into the rulemaking stage, and it's an example of the what and the how in action. And so that would be SB 1158. And we're committed as a district to making sure that we meet the mandates of SB 1158. And again, teamwork makes the dream work. There are so many staff across this company that are going to be actively involved in this regulatory proceeding because of the operational lift that is going to be required for us to meet the mandates of this bill. And so SB 1158 created or indicated the what needs to be done. It's hourly reporting of GHG emissions. Now the California Energy Commission is responsible for actually telling us how is this going to happen. And if we can do our jobs effectively, we're going to be involved in saying how this happens as well. So the work's just beginning on this one. Okay.
And what does your gut tell you on this one? How great of an impact do you feel like TID and its partners on the issue are going to be able to have on regulations like this?
I think that when we look at the emerging renewables space and how greenhouse gas emissions are going to be accounted for in the future, I think the key constants is looking at and assessing how variable energy resources. So this means that energy that's intermittent. So think wind, solar. How does that take the place of traditionally utilized energy resources that's not intermittent? So you have these variable energy resources that are coming into play, and we're trying to think about those resources in terms of reliability and stability for our grid. And I think that the key to making all of this work for both these variable energy resources to get integrated, but then also for the accounting and the emissions to sort of be fully conveyed to our customers, it's just going to take what we talked about earlier in this podcast. That it's that collaboration and it's that reliance on your subject matter experts to speak into the process so that we have the best possible rule that reflects the capabilities of large, medium-sized, and small load-serving entities across the state of California. So it's going to be complex. My gut tells me that we're going to be okay, though.
Okay, great. All right, on that positive note, let's look towards the future of regulation. Where will the big impacts come from, and how will TID position ourselves to respond to those? Austin, you want to take that first?
So California is a change leader, meaning if there's an opportunity, it's carpe diem for us. We seize the day with respect to reducing greenhouse gas emissions and really just thinking about climate and trying to promote public health. California is really just one of the leading places in the world where you're going to see a push for clean air and clean water. When we think about these things in a nutshell, we want to tackle these things holistically. So no man is an island. We're all working together to sort of reduce our emissions, integrate emerging renewables, promote and sort of foster greater public health as a consequence of these things. And really to do that, we have to think long term. We have to think at the long term impact. And as a load serving entity on the energy side of things, one of the big things for us when we think about long-term impact is yes, we want to reduce our emissions. Yes, we want to promote public health, but we want to do these things at a pace and at a scale that does not harm the customers in the community that we serve. Our mission is to be good stewards of the resources that we have. And to do that, we have to speak into these processes in the pace at which these processes happen. We all want to go in the same direction in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The key is going to be in how we get there in terms of how quickly. Sometimes we can't go as fast as we'd want to. And that's not because we don't want to and we're not trying and doing everything that we can. It's just the reality of technology, markets, what have you. There are things that have to be developed and those things take time. And so sometimes we're just at the mercy of time. When speaking about time, you can't neglect the environment either, because renewables are incredible, but we have to study and we have to make sure that we understand the environmental impact that a shifting and evolving grid is going to have. And that aspect, we could spend the whole podcast just talking about that. But that is something that we cannot leave hanging. We can't leave hanging as we look forward and look ahead. So that would be the energy side of things, but I know that doesn't just simply include energy.
Sure. Does that bleed into the water area as well, Herb?
Yeah, it goes in there as well. California is always, a lot of times people could say California government moves slow, right? But at the same time, when they move, they move. In 2014, we became the last state to regulate groundwater within the nation. And so that happened. But since then, California is moving on a lot of different things. And a point I'll mention probably later too is the next 20 years is definitely going to move a lot faster and have a lot of things affecting TID on the regulatory front and legislative front than the previous 20 years. It just moves so fast. There's just a lot more people getting involved in these proceedings. And it's like the way I like to put it is TID's always been, we've been around for more than 135 years, right? We've always been a good water manager. We've always been compliant with regulatory laws and agencies. We've always been stewards of the river, and we've always, encouraged our growers to manage water well. We've managed water well. And we've always been, like, for lack of a better phrase, the good actors, right, in the water community. And we take pride in that. And for a long, long time, everyone, especially locally, everyone was on board with that. At the state level, they understood that as well. And there wasn't a ton of scrutiny. And in this kind of new era of California being a change leader, we're still all those things, TID is, but at the same time, the scrutiny is kind of ramped up more, especially as we get into, drought and other items like that. There's more non-governmental organizations that are paying attention to what regulatory agencies do. Austin mentioned the environmental side. There's a lot of environmental organizations that are advocating for various things as well that don't necessarily wholly align with some of the things the district's looking to do or agrees with. And then there's just a lot of other people, too, in the water regulated community that may disagree and want a regulation to be a certain way. And so this whole concept of the next 20 years is going to be completely wholly different than the previous 20 years in terms of water policy and water regulation is just something that is going to be tackled, and it's going to happen quicker than I think a lot of people think.
Austin, what about renewable energy? You've mentioned that a few times already today, but what does that look like in the future of regulations that are headed our way?
Yeah, Constance. So we have mandates in place, and really this is let's take a step back, big picture. Where are we going as a state? So right now, California policy has directed all of us to be 60% renewable. So 60% of the resources, the energy that's being used to serve our customers' load, is to be served by renewable energy by 2030. Secondarily, by 2045, we have a 100% mandate that all retail sales of electricity that are being used to serve customer load come from renewable energy resources, and they're carbon free. So here's the thing. Here's the question is TID positioned to meet these mandates that are aggressive? And my answer to that would be is yes. We're positioned to meet those mandates. Here's why. The reason why is because collaboration, teamwork, and having a management that puts staff in positions where they can succeed are just staples of this company. And it's how it's just sort of how we operate. And so we have people in positions that look at that challenge and don't necessarily see a challenge, but they see an opportunity that they want to seize. And so we have a whole host of subject matter experts that have a knowledge that is specifically based to those two numbers that I just shared with you. And those numbers are going to be touchstones for how we make decisions as we look at the time that exists from now to 2030. And then from 2030 to 2045. And so that's going to mean that we're going to see new assets that we're going to be adding into our portfolio. That's going to mean that we're going to be looking at new technologies, renewables. And these are exciting things because the consequences of these things, if done at a pace and a scale, and if done in an active and collaborative process, are just going to mean the overall improvement and vitality of our communities. And that's something that's exciting, and that's something to look at as an opportunity as we move forward. The way in which the rules are implemented when looking at sort of these touchstone dates that are always so critical and always so often cited by legislators and regulatory staffers, the ways in which these rules are implemented is just going to be critical. And that is where our work begins. That is where our work begins as a staff here at TID. And it's no one regulatory analyst taking it on. It is a whole ohana.
Herb, going back to Sigma, which you spoke about earlier, in looking ahead at the future of that, now that the plan has been submitted, we're waiting for kind of the state's ruling on that. What does the future look like for that regulation?
Yeah, so the plan's been submitted, right? We submitted that in 2022, and we're waiting to hear. And, come 2024, we'll know if the plan that we've spent, good amount of time developing is going to get implemented. And that plan has various programs, policies, and projects in it. And we're going to get to see, what combination of that's going to get us to a sustainable goal on a lot of different metrics that we have in there. It's developed. We'll see if it gets approved. And we're going to see what ends up happening with that. There's a lot of end goals in that plan, but at the end of the day, there's going to be many stepping stones throughout until 2042, where TID gets a chance to tell its story and remind people of its position as a net recharger within the Turlock subbasin. Then that recharge comes to the groundwater basin by way of surface water that we use and that our growers use, that we import from the Tuolumne into our canal system, that our growers flood irrigate, and then it goes in there to the tune of an average of 100,000 acre feet a year on average, depending on the water year. And so that story we get to keep telling, no matter what happens with the regulation. I think the big thing that's going to kind of come about, the how that we've talked about related to Sigma, these GSAs are, we are one of 12 members of the West Turlock Subbasin GSA, which is in the Turlock Subbasin. And we are one member of a 12-member little local regulatory agency that ultimately is going to determine how groundwater gets pumped, what pricing for that will look like, if there's incentives or disincentives, what overpumping costs could be, what projects get implemented so that we could recharge more water, what programs are there, for allocating water to growers and how that looks. There's a lot of different paths we can take over the next 20 years as we get closer to 2042 and reaching sustainability. And there's just a lot in there that's going to affect people. And some of it's going to be more positive. A lot of people claim this is very draconian, but it's probably going to be much less trying to stay on the positive front that my friend Austin was doing. A lot of this stuff is going to end up faring pretty well, but there'll be some things that related to pumping and costs that I still think a lot of people still haven't quite really wrapped their head around as far as how it hits on the ground level to the growers. And we continue to spread the word about that. And I think that Sigma is a perfect example of how the next 20 years is going to be different. And I said that before, but it's true. It's like historically, TID has been kind of on this island. We're a local agency. We operate a local project in the Don Pedro project with our partners. We're not tied to the federal Central Valley project or the state water project. We're compliant with laws. We've been good actors, and people have just kind of let that be. And I guess the asteroid hasn't come hit the planet yet. But there's asteroids out there that we're trying to protect the TID planet from, and our customers trying to protect them and advocate for them. But, things are coming a lot faster and a lot quicker. And that next 20 years is just going to really set a path for what the future of irrigation water in the Central Valley and for our customers look like. It'll always be there. It's the agricultural, the socioeconomic, hotbed is our Central Valley and TID for what we provide the state and the country, and by way of, jobs and economy and food and fiber. That'll still be there. But how it looks is going to be a lot different than, the generations that have come before us.
Well, I think we know this, that with regard to energy and water and a host of other types of regulations, they're going to keep coming. They're going to keep coming fast and furious. And I think we are very fortunate as a district to have the two of you kind of keeping an eye on those, tracking where those are going to hit us, going back to the asteroid analogy. So thank you for keeping an eye out and for being our regulatory watchdogs. We appreciate it, and we appreciate having you guys on today to explain what you do and how you do it.
Thanks, Constance. It's been a lot of fun.
Heck yeah, Constance, thanks for having us.
Thank you for tuning in to the TID Water and Power Podcast. You can find TID on Facebook at facebook.com/TurlockID, on Instagram and Twitter at TurlockID, and on LinkedIn as the Turlock Irrigation District. I'm your host, Constance Anderson. We'll see you again next time.